Welcome back to Detective Podcast. Tonight's story creeps out of the shadows. But before we step inside, tell us, where in the world are you listening from? Drop your city and country in the comments and become part of our growing circle of curious minds. Now, settle in. The investigation begins. Chapter 1. The fire had burned itself out before dawn, but the smell of it lingered stubbornly in the valley, clinging to stone and soil like an accusation that would not be withdrawn. St. Cuthbert's Chapel stood at the edge of the village of Emberley, a squat medieval building of grey limestone, now blackened as though night itself had scorched it. Its small bell tower leaned slightly eastward, as it had for 3 centuries, yet this morning it seemed to bow under a new and dreadful weight. The windows were empty sockets. The roof had collapsed inward. Charcoal beams lay strewn like broken ribs across the nave, and at the centre of the ruin lay a body. It was Father Adrian Hume, the chapel's caretaker and lay preacher, stretched peacefully upon the stone floor before the altar. His hands were folded across his chest. His face was calm, untouched, almost serene. Not a hair on his head had been singed. The villagers stood at a careful distance, murmuring in low voices. No one dared step closer. The fire had been fierce enough to melt the chalice, to crack the stone font, to turn the wooden pews to cinders. Yet Father Hume's clothes were intact. Even the thin paper prayer book tucked beneath his arm was unburned. "God preserved him," whispered Mrs. Alcott, clutching her shawl tight about her shoulders. "You can see it plain as day." "Nonsense," muttered Dr. Everley, though without conviction. "Fire behaves strangely. Pockets of air, variations in heat." But he did not move forward either. The chapel doors had been locked from the inside. Constable Reed stood with his notebook pressed uselessly against his chest, staring at the scene with the haunted look of a man who has written down facts that refuse to behave like facts. He had already tried the doors himself. Thick oak, iron-banded, their lock fused by heat. The only key had been found in Father Hume's pocket. No signs of intrusion, Reed said to no one in particular. No open windows, no footprints. Fire started inside, near the altar. "And the body?" asked Sir Lionel Barrington, who had arrived early and uninvited, wrapped in a greatcoat of fine wool. He was the sort of man who always arrived early and uninvited, especially where tragedy offered an audience. Reed swallowed. "Untouched." Sir Lionel smiled faintly. "A miracle, then." The word passed through the crowd like a spark through dry grass. Miracle, judgment, a sign. At the edge of the gathering stood a small, round man in a black cassock, his hat held politely in both hands. He had arrived quietly on the morning train and walked up from the station while the smoke still rose in pale ribbons from the chapel ruins. No one had noticed him arrive. No one had yet asked his name. Father Brown observed the scene with mild, almost sleepy interest, as though watching children argue over the rules of a game he understood better than they did. He noticed what others did not, the way the stone beneath the body was darker than the surrounding floor. The faint, bitter scent beneath the smoke, sharp, chemical. The expression on Sir Lionel's face, which was not wonder, but satisfaction. Father Brown said nothing. By midday, Emberley was no longer merely a village, but a question mark. People came from neighbouring towns to see the chapel. Some knelt, some crossed themselves. Others whispered excitedly, as though proximity to mystery were a form of entertainment. Pamphlets appeared before evening. "The man God would not burn," printed hastily and sold with indecent speed. Julian Mercer arrived with them. He stood apart from the crowd, his coat dusty from travel, his eyes fixed on the blackened chapel. He had known Father Hume well, too well perhaps. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, though he did not smoke it. "This will ruin everything," he murmured. Father Brown, passing by at that moment, paused. "Or reveal it," he said gently. Julian started. "I beg your pardon?" Father Brown smiled apologetically. "I have a habit of answering people who speak aloud to their consciences." Julian stared at him for a moment, then gave a strained laugh. "And you'll be very busy here." "I expect so," Father Brown replied. That afternoon, the body was moved, reluctantly, reverently, to the village hall. Dr. Everley conducted his examination in silence, watched by Constable Reed and 3 men who crossed themselves every time the doctor touched the corpse. "No burns," Everley said at last. "No smoke in the lungs." "So he was dead before the fire," Reed said, almost certainly. Sir Lionel leaned against the wall, arms folded. "And how did the fire begin?" Everley hesitated. "An accelerant. Oil, perhaps. Something deliberate." A murmur rippled through the room. "Suicide," someone said. "Sacrifice," said another. Sir Lionel smiled again. "Or martyrdom." Father Brown cleared his throat softly. "May I ask a question?" he said. They turned, surprised, as though noticing him for the first time. "Who locked the doors?" Father Brown asked. Reed frowned. "Father Hume, presumably." "And who had reason to ensure no one interrupted him?" Father Brown continued. No one answered. "And," Father Brown added mildly, "who benefits most from a miracle?" Sir Lionel's smile did not falter, but his eyes hardened. By evening, candles burned along the road to the chapel. Mrs. Alcott led prayers, others wept openly. Emberley had always been a devout village, but devotion, like fire, can be encouraged to burn too fiercely. Father Brown stood at the back, listening. Faith, he knew, could warm a soul or scorch it. As night fell, the ruins of St. Cuthbert's glowed faintly under the moon, a skeleton of stone and shadow. Somewhere in the dark, an owl cried. The village settled uneasily into sleep. Father Brown did not sleep. He sat by the window of the small room lent to him above the baker's shop, staring toward the chapel, thinking not of fire or miracles, but of men, of fear dressed as holiness, of control disguised as faith, of a body that would not burn because it was never meant to. And he knew, with the quiet certainty that often troubled him, that the fire had not finished its work. Not yet. Chapter 2. By the following morning, Emberley had learned a new way to speak. Its ordinary conversations about weather, livestock, the price of bread, had been replaced by murmurs shaped like prayers and questions that dared not ask themselves aloud. People spoke softly now, even indoors, as though the fire had left behind not ashes, but ears. Father Brown walked through the village lanes at an unhurried pace, his hands clasped behind his back, his round hat tilted slightly forward. He listened more than he looked. The baker's wife paused mid-sentence when she noticed him pass. 2 boys stopped their game and stared. He nodded kindly to them, and they ran away as though forgiven for something they had not yet done. Outside the post office, a small knot of villagers had gathered around Sir Lionel Barrington, who leaned against the stone wall like a lecturer enjoying his own echo. "You must understand," Sir Lionel was saying, "miracles are not meant to comfort us. They are meant to command us." Mrs. Alcott nodded vigorously. "That's what Father Hume always said, faith is obedience." "Precisely," Sir Lionel replied. "And now heaven itself has confirmed his teaching." Father Brown stopped at a respectful distance. He appeared interested in a sparrow hopping near the gutter. "And what," asked a thin man with ink-stained fingers, Mr. Talbot, the schoolmaster, "does heaven command us to do next?" Sir Lionel smiled. "That will become clear. It always does." Father Brown bent down and scattered a few crumbs from his pocket. The sparrow fluttered closer. "Forgive me," Father Brown said mildly, "but may I ask who decides when heaven has finished speaking?" Sir Lionel turned, surprised. "I beg your pardon?" Father Brown straightened. "Miracles are like metaphors," he said. "They say a great deal, but not always what the loudest voice claims they mean." Mrs. Alcott bristled. "Are you suggesting we doubt God?" "I am suggesting," Father Brown replied gently, "that God is quite capable of surviving our questions." Sir Lionel's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" "Just a priest," Father Brown said, smiling. "And priests are very fond of questions. They keep us employed." There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Then Sir Lionel laughed lightly. "Well, Father Brown?" "Well, Father Brown," Sir Lionel said, "I hope you will forgive us if we place more trust in a sign from heaven than in human reasoning." Father Brown inclined his head. "Human reasoning is very unreliable," he agreed. "That is why I study it so carefully." Later that morning, Constable Reed found Father Brown in the village hall, seated alone near the long oak table where Father Hume had lain the day before. The hall was empty now, stripped of its solemn purpose, and returned to its ordinary echo. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," Reed said, rubbing his chin, "but things aren't sitting right." Father Brown looked up. "Things rarely do," he said. "They tend to sprawl." Reed sighed. "There's pressure from Barrington, from the village. They don't want an investigation, not really. They want a story." "Stories are easier to live with," Father Brown said. "They have beginnings and endings." "And crimes don't?" "Crimes," said Father Brown, have middles." Reed grimaced. The fire was set carefully, too carefully for despair. And Father Hume, he wasn't the sort. "The sort to die?" Father Brown asked. "The sort to stage a miracle," Reed replied. "He believed deeply, yes, but he was obedient. He followed ideas, he didn't invent them." Father Brown nodded. "Ideas are much more dangerous when they belong to someone else." Reed frowned. "You think he was used?" "I think," Father Brown said, "that belief is often borrowed and debts are always collected." That afternoon, Julian Mercer stood in the shell of St. Cuthbert's Chapel, staring at the place where the altar had once stood. The fire had erased most things, but not the shape of absence. You could still see where objects had been, like memories burned into the stone. "You shouldn't be here," he said without turning. "I am very fond of shouldn'ts," Father Brown replied, stepping carefully over the blackened threshold. Julian turned, startled. "You move quietly for a man of your size." "I have had practice," Father Brown said. "People rarely notice me until I stop." Julian exhaled sharply. "They're turning him into a saint." "Saints are useful," Father Brown said. "They do a great deal of work while remaining conveniently dead." Julian's jaw tightened. Father Hume wasn't a saint, he was frightened. Of what? Julian hesitated. Of being wrong. Father Brown regarded him steadily. "That is a very religious fear." Julian laughed bitterly. "He was always being corrected, by Sir Lionel, by pamphlets, by doctrines that arrived already wrapped and labelled. He thought obedience meant surrendering his doubts." "And did it?" Father Brown asked. Julian stared at the scorched stones. "It surrendered him." Father Brown was silent for a moment. "Did Father Hume know the fire was coming?" Julian closed his eyes. "I don't know. But he knew something would happen. Something that would prove the message." "Proof," Father Brown murmured, "is a terrible substitute for truth." That evening, Dr. Everley sat alone in his surgery, rereading his notes. Father Brown knocked softly and entered without ceremony. "I was hoping you might help me," Father Brown said. Everley sighed. "If you're here to ask about miracles." "I am here to ask about bodies," Father Brown replied. They are much more honest. Everly gestured to the chair. The cause of death was not the fire. Heart failure, most likely, induced by shock or exertion. Fear? Father Brown asked. Everly nodded slowly. Yes, fear could do it. And the accelerant? Applied after death, Everly said, carefully, almost reverently. Father Brown folded his hands, as one dresses an altar. Everly looked up sharply. You think this was ritual? I think, Father Brown said, it was theatre. Night returned to Emberley with a heavy, expectant air. Candles flickered in windows. Sir Lionel hosted a gathering at the manor, speaking eloquently of signs and obedience. Outside, a few villagers knelt in the cold, praying for guidance they believed had already arrived. Father Brown walked alone, past the chapel ruins, past the green, toward the dark fields beyond. Faith, he reflected, was meant to illuminate the world, not to set it ablaze. Somewhere in Emberley, a man believed he had been chosen to interpret heaven. Father Brown believed otherwise, and he had begun to see the shape of the belief that killed. Chapter 3. The inquest was held in the long drawing room of Barrington Manor, a space chosen less for its suitability than for its symbolism. Tall windows looked out over lawns trimmed into obedience. Portraits of severe men watched from the walls, their eyes following every movement with inherited authority. The room smelled faintly of polish and old certainty. Father Brown took a seat near the back, unnoticed and uninvited, as was increasingly his custom. Constable Reed stood at a small table, papers in hand, looking as though he would rather face another fire than the people assembled before him. Sir Lionel Barrington sat prominently at the front, composed, immaculate, already wearing the expression of a man prepared to guide others toward the correct conclusion. Dr. Everly gave his testimony plainly. Cause of death, cardiac failure, prior to the fire. Time of death, shortly before midnight. The fire, deliberate, accelerated, controlled. Murmurs rose, then settled. Sir Lionel stood. Then we may conclude, he said smoothly, that Father Hume died in a state of grace, preserved from corruption, even in death. No, Constable Reed said, louder than he meant to. We may conclude he was dead before the fire. Sir Lionel smiled indulgently. Science describes the mechanism, Constable. Faith explains the meaning. Father Brown shifted slightly in his chair. And who, he asked quietly, decides which meaning is correct? Heads turned. Sir Lionel regarded him with mild irritation. I believe we've met, Sir Lionel said. Father Brown, is it? You are welcome to observe, of course, but interpretation is a serious matter. Indeed, Father Brown replied. That is why I am concerned it has begun so early. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. The coroner cleared his throat. Unless there are further facts? There are, Father Brown said. Sir Lionel raised an eyebrow. By all means. Father Brown stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He merely spoke, as one might speak to a child who has misunderstood a rule. The chapel doors were locked from the inside, he said. This has been treated as proof of divine mystery, but it is also proof of human planning. A few people frowned. Locks, Father Brown continued, are not barriers, they are promises, promises that no one will interrupt what is meant to happen inside. Sir Lionel laughed softly. You suggest Father Hume locked himself in to die? I suggest, Father Brown said, that someone else needed him to stay. After the inquest dissolved into polite confusion, Father Brown found himself walking alongside Sir Lionel through the manor gardens. The gravel crunched underfoot with deliberate clarity. You are an interesting man, Father, Sir Lionel said. You undermine certainty with a smile. I find certainty undermines itself, Father Brown replied. Sir Lionel stopped near a yew hedge, trimmed into a severe cross. You are implying manipulation. Of whom exactly? Father Brown looked at the hedge. Of the obedient. Sir Lionel's eyes sharpened. Obedience is a virtue. So is humility, Father Brown said. They are often mistaken for each other. Sir Lionel folded his hands behind his back. You think Father Hume was coerced? I think, Father Brown said, he was convinced. And you disapprove of conviction? I disapprove of convictions that cannot survive doubt. Sir Lionel smiled thinly. Faith requires surrender. Only to God, Father Brown replied. Never to men who claim to speak for him. Sir Lionel's smile vanished. You tread dangerously close to slander. Father Brown inclined his head. Then let us both tread carefully. That evening Julian Mercer sat alone in the schoolhouse, surrounded by books he no longer taught from. Father Brown entered quietly. I wondered when you would come, Julian said without looking up. I wondered when you would stop pretending you weren't waiting, Father Brown replied. Julian closed his book. They're planning a vigil, a procession. Sir Lionel says Emberley has been chosen. Chosen people are often exhausted by the responsibility, Father Brown said. Julian rubbed his temples. Father Hume used to confess to me, not sins, doubts. He was afraid that faith had become theatrical. A performance? Father Brown asked. A script, Julian said, with no room for error. Father Brown nodded. Plays are dangerous when the audience is told they must applaud. Julian hesitated. The night of the fire, Father Hume asked me for lamp oil, said he needed extra for the sanctuary lamps. And you gave it to him? Yes. Did he seem afraid? Julian swallowed. Resolved, as if fear had been replaced by purpose. Father Brown looked at him gently. Fear often disguises itself as purpose when it can no longer bear to be honest. The vigil took place 2 nights later. Villagers processed toward the ruins of St. Cuthbert's Chapel, candles raised, faces lit from below, like figures carved by belief rather than stone. Sir Lionel led them, his voice carrying scripture and certainty in equal measure. Father Brown walked among them, unnoticed again. At the chapel, Sir Lionel spoke of sacrifice, of divine signs, of obedience rewarded. The crowd listened, breath held, hearts racing toward meaning. Then Father Brown stepped forward. My friends, he said softly. Sir Lionel turned sharply. This is not the time. It is always the time, Father Brown said, to stop a fire before it spreads. A murmur rippled. You believe a miracle has occurred, Father Brown continued, but miracles do not demand silence. They invite transformation. Sir Lionel's voice hardened. You insult their faith. I defend it, Father Brown replied, from those who would use it as a leash. Sir Lionel stepped closer. Be careful, Father. Father Brown met his gaze. I am. He turned to the crowd. Ask yourselves this. Why must this miracle be explained by one man alone? Why must doubt be treated as disobedience? Why must faith now march in step? The candles flickered. Faces shifted. Sir Lionel spoke sharply. Enough. No, Father Brown said gently. Enough has already happened. Later that night, Constable Reed knocked on Father Brown's door. We found something, he said. In the ruins, beneath a fallen beam, lay a small metal container, empty, its lid scorched but intact. The smell inside was sharp, unmistakable. And this, Reed added, producing a folded paper. It was a sermon draft written in Father Hume's hand, margins crowded with corrections, not his own. Father Brown read silently. Faith must be seen, one note read. Doubt weakens authority, another insisted. Obedience proves truth. Father Brown folded the paper carefully. They taught him how to die, he said softly. Reed frowned. Who? Father Brown looked toward Barrington Manor, dark against the sky. Someone who mistook control for conviction, he replied. The night was very still, and the fire, Father Brown knew, had one last place to burn. Chapter 4. The morning after the vigil dawned pale and uncertain, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise over Emberley. A thin mist lay across the fields, blurring hedgerows and softening edges, and the village moved within it quietly, like a thought not yet fully formed. Father Brown walked early, before most windows showed signs of life. He passed the ruined chapel without stopping, though his eyes lingered on it with the familiarity of one who has already taken its measure. What concerned him now was not the place, but what it had awakened. Faith, once stirred, rarely returns willingly to sleep. At the rectory, a modest house long unused, its former vicar having died years earlier, Father Brown was met by Mrs. Alcott, who stood in the doorway as if guarding the threshold between certainty and chaos. "They're saying you tried to break the vigil," she said, not unkindly, but with a tremor of disappointment. "I tried to break the fire," Father Brown replied. "It's a common confusion." She folded her arms. "Sir Lionel says doubt is a temptation." Father Brown smiled gently. "So is certainty." She did not smile back. "You should speak with him, privately, for the village's sake." "For his?" Father Brown asked. She hesitated, then stepped aside to let him pass. Sir Lionel Barrington received Father Brown in the Manor's library, a room lined with books that appeared to have been selected more for their bindings than their contents. A fire burned low in the hearth. Sir Lionel stood by the mantel, one hand resting casually upon it, as though the house itself were an extension of his authority. "You are causing unrest," Sir Lionel said, without preamble. Father Brown removed his hat. "Unrest is often caused by what has already happened. I merely refuse to call it peace." Sir Lionel's lips tightened. "You undermine faith." "No," Father Brown said. "I undermine fear dressed as faith." Sir Lionel turned sharply. "You accuse me." "I accuse no one," Father Brown replied. "I describe patterns. Accusations are for courts." Sir Lionel laughed softly. "Then let me describe one. A village shaken by tragedy seeks meaning. A man arrives, questions everything, and leaves chaos in his wake." Father Brown nodded. "That does happen." Sir Lionel leaned closer. "And what if the village needs guidance, structure, a firm hand?" "Then," Father Brown said, "it must be protected from hands that close too tightly." Sir Lionel's voice dropped. "Father Hume believed in obedience." "He believed in safety," Father Brown replied. "Obedience was the shape safety took when fear could no longer be named." Sir Lionel's eyes flashed. "You think you understand him better than I did?" "I think," Father Brown said quietly, "that you understood what he would surrender." Later that day, Dr. Everley and Constable Reed stood together in the surgery, examining a ledger recovered from the chapel vestry. Father Brown joined them, peering over Everley's shoulder. "These entries," Everley said, tapping the page, "aren't donations, they're expenditures, oil candles, pamphlets, all approved by Barrington." Reed frowned. "He funded the chapel." "He funded the message," Father Brown corrected. Everley hesitated. "There's something else. Father Hume came to me weeks before the fire, complained of palpitations, anxiety. He said he was being tested." Reed looked up sharply. "By whom?" Everley sighed. "He didn't say, but he asked me whether fear could be mistaken for faith." Father Brown closed his eyes briefly. "It often is." That evening, Julian Mercer stood before the blackened chapel ruins once more, a lantern at his feet. Father Brown approached from the shadows. "I keep thinking," Julian said, "that if I'd spoken sooner." "You did speak," Father Brown said. "You spoke to someone who listened." Julian shook his head. "I should have spoken louder." "Loud voices," Father Brown replied, "are not always heard. Quiet truths sometimes echo longer." Julian swallowed. "Sir Lionel came to Father Hume that night. I saw him leave." Father Brown's expression did not change. "What did they speak of?" Julian hesitated. "Sacrifice. Example. How the village needed certainty." "And Father Hume?" Julian looked away. "He asked whether God ever demanded proof." Father Brown said nothing. Julian's voice broke. He was terrified of being a coward. Father Brown placed a hand gently on Julian's arm. "Courage is not the absence of fear," he said. "It is the refusal to weaponize it." The following morning the village gathered again, but this time not for prayer. Constable Reed stood at the green, papers in hand, his voice unsteady but determined. Sir Lionel watched from the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable. Reed cleared his throat. "We have reason to believe Father Hume did not act alone, that the fire was arranged after his death, that his fear was encouraged." A murmur swelled. Sir Lionel stepped forward. "This is slander. You insult the dead." Father Brown stepped beside Reed. "No," he said softly. "We honor him by telling the truth." Sir Lionel laughed sharply. "Truth? From a priest who sows doubt?" Father Brown turned to the crowd. "Tell me," he said, "when did your faith begin to require permission?" Silence answered him. "Father Hume was told that obedience meant silence," Father Brown continued. "That doubt was disloyalty. That fear, properly arranged, could glorify God." Sir Lionel raised his voice. "And you claim otherwise?" "I claim," Father Brown said, "that God does not need victims." A gasp rippled through the villagers. Father Brown looked at Sir Lionel. "You locked the doors to keep interruption out. You lit the fire to create meaning, and you called it faith." Sir Lionel's composure cracked. "You cannot prove—" "I can," Father Brown said gently. "But more importantly, you already have." Sir Lionel faltered. His gaze darted not toward escape, but toward the people who no longer looked at him with reverence. Fear, once redirected, is a dangerous thing. That night, Sir Lionel Barrington sat alone in his library as the constable's knock sounded at the door. The fire in the hearth burned low. Father Brown stood outside, listening. He did not feel triumph, only sorrow. Faith had been bent into a tool, and a man had died to prove a lie, but lies, like fires, consume their fuel. And at last, the flames were turning inward. Chapter 5. The arrest of Sir Lionel Barrington did not bring relief to Emberley. It brought something far more unsettling. Space. Without his voice filling it, the village discovered how much of its silence had been borrowed. People moved more slowly now, as though uncertain which thoughts were still permitted. Curtains twitched, doors closed more carefully than before, and conversations dissolved into awkward pauses when they strayed too near belief. Father Brown noticed this most keenly at breakfast in the baker's shop, where the usual clatter of plates had given way to a subdued politeness. "They say he meant well," Mrs. Hodge murmured, pouring tea with unnecessary precision. "That he only wanted to protect us." "Protection," Father Brown replied mildly, "is often what fear calls itself when it wishes to be obeyed." She frowned, unconvinced, but said nothing more. Sir Lionel was held in a small room above the constable's office, stripped of grandeur and certainty alike. The walls were bare, the window narrow. When Father Brown was permitted to see him, Sir Lionel stood with his back to the door, staring out at the fields beyond the village as though expecting them to explain themselves. They've turned against me, Sir Lionel said without looking around. They've begun to think, Father Brown replied. Sir Lionel laughed bitterly. Thinking is overrated. It only leads to division. On the contrary, Father Brown said, it leads to responsibility. Sir Lionel turned. His face looked older, thinner, like a man who had mistaken authority for nourishment. You believe you've won? Father Brown shook his head. No, I believe someone has lost. Sir Lionel's eyes flashed. Father Hume chose his path. He was guided toward it, Father Brown said gently. Like a man led to the edge of a cliff and told the fall will make him fly. Sir Lionel's voice rose. Faith demands sacrifice. Faith, Father Brown replied, demands honesty. Sir Lionel stared at him. You think I am a monster. I think, Father Brown said, you are a man who could not bear uncertainty, and so you demanded certainty from others. Silence fell between them. At first, Sir Lionel said quietly, it was only encouragement, structure, people crave it. Yes, Father Brown said, especially when they are afraid. I did not plan for him to die, Sir Lionel muttered. But you planned for him not to interrupt the story, Father Brown replied. Sir Lionel closed his eyes. Outside, the village struggled with its own accounting. The vigil candles had burned down to stubs, now scattered like relics no one quite knew how to discard. Pamphlets were torn down. The chapel ruins stood unchanged, yet their meaning shifted with each passing hour, from miracle to crime scene to monument of shame. Julian Mercer stood before them again, this time joined by Constable Reed. They're asking me to speak, Julian said, to explain. Reed grimaced. They want a replacement story. Father Brown approached from behind. Then give them a better question, he said. Julian turned. What question? Father Brown looked at the ruins. Ask them what faith is for. Julian swallowed. And if they don't like the answer? Father Brown smiled faintly. Faith rarely begins where comfort ends. That afternoon, a meeting was held in the village hall. No altar, no banners, just chairs arranged unevenly, as though the room itself were uncertain how to proceed. Father Brown sat among them, not apart. Mrs. Alcott stood first, her voice trembling. I prayed harder than I ever have, and I was wrong. Father Brown shook his head. You were sincere? Is that enough? She asked. Sometimes, he said, it is the beginning. Mr. Talbot, the schoolmaster, cleared his throat. We wanted certainty. We wanted to be told what it all meant. And someone obliged, Father Brown said. Julian stood. Father Hume believed doubt was disobedience. He believed fear was holiness. A murmur ran through the hall. Father Brown rose slowly. Fear, he said, is not a sin. It is a condition. But when fear is given a uniform and a voice of authority, it becomes tyranny. A woman at the back whispered, Then what is faith? Father Brown paused. Faith, he said at last, is trust without coercion. It does not demand proof through fire. It does not require silence, and it never needs a corpse to make its point. The room was very still. That night, Dr. Everley sat with Father Brown by the surgery fire. I keep wondering, Everley said, whether I could have stopped it. You did what you could, Father Brown replied. You listened. Everley frowned. Listening doesn't feel like enough. It rarely does, Father Brown said, but it is what most people lack. Everley stared into the flames. Sir Lionel truly believed he was right. Yes, Father Brown said, and that belief cost him his conscience. Sir Lionel was taken away the following morning. No crowds gathered, no curses were shouted. The village watched from behind curtains as though observing a funeral for an idea they had once loved. Father Brown stood near the road, hat in hand. As the carriage passed, Sir Lionel looked out. Their eyes met. For a moment, Sir Lionel's expression softened, not into repentance, but into something closer to weariness. "I only wanted to be certain," he said quietly. Father Brown nodded. "Certainty is expensive," he replied. "And it is rarely worth the price." The carriage moved on. By evening, rain began to fall, slow and steady, washing soot from stone and dampening the last traces of ash. The ruins of St. Cuthbert's darkened, not with fire, but with water soaking into old wounds. Julian stood beside Father Brown under the shelter of a tree. "What happens now?" Julian asked. "Now," Father Brown said, "you rebuild." "The chapel?" "Perhaps," Father Brown replied. "Or perhaps you rebuild trust first." Julian nodded. "And you?" "I will leave," Father Brown said, "before I become a solution." Julian smiled sadly. "You saved us." Father Brown shook his head. "No, I merely reminded you that faith cannot be borrowed, enforced, or proven with flames." They stood in silence as the rain fell. Somewhere in Emberley a fire had gone out, and in its place something quieter and far more difficult was beginning to burn. Chapter 6. In the days that followed Sir Lionel's removal, Emberley entered a peculiar season, one not marked by calendar or weather, but by uncertainty stripped of spectacle. The village was no longer aflame with belief, nor was it at peace. It was simply awake. Father Brown remained a little longer than he had intended. He told himself it was because Constable Reed still had paperwork to finish, because Julian Mercer needed company, because Dr. Everley insisted on one last conversation. In truth, he stayed because wounds do not close the moment the blade is withdrawn. They ache, they weep, and sometimes they ask questions long after the danger has passed. On the third morning, Father Brown walked again to the ruins of St. Cuthbert's Chapel. Rain had softened the ash into streaks of grey that ran like tears down the stone. Weeds already pressed through cracks in the floor, indifferent to tragedy, loyal only to persistence. Mrs. Alcott was there, scrubbing one of the surviving stones with a stiff brush. "You needn't do that," Father Brown said gently. She looked up, startled. "I need to do something." He nodded. "That is often the truest reason." She scrubbed in silence for a moment. "I believed him," she said at last. "Sir Lionel?" He spoke so clearly, so confidently. "Confidence," Father Brown replied, "is a loud voice for a quiet truth." She paused. "Does that mean faith should be uncertain?" "No," Father Brown said. "It means it should be free." She straightened, leaning on the brush. "Then what do we do with Father Hume?" Father Brown looked at the darkened altar space. "We remember him as he was, a frightened man who wanted to be good." Mrs. Alcott's eyes filled. "That seems small." "Small," Father Brown said softly, "is where mercy lives." That afternoon, Julian Mercer gathered a few villagers in the schoolhouse, not to teach, but to listen. Chairs were pulled into an uneven circle. No one stood at the front. "We don't need a sermon," Julian said, "and we don't need a verdict, but we do need to speak honestly." There was a long pause. Then Mr. Talbot spoke. "I wanted answers, clean ones." "So did I," said another. "I wanted to feel chosen," Mrs. Hodge admitted. "Like it meant something that this happened here." Julian nodded. "And now?" A woman near the window said quietly, "Now I just want to know how to live without being told what it means." Father Brown, seated quietly among them, felt a small inward relief. This was the sound of a village relearning its own voice. That evening, Father Brown visited Sir Lionel one final time before his transfer. The room seemed smaller now, the air stripped of ceremony. Sir Lionel sat on the narrow bed, his hands folded, not in prayer, but in habit. "You've come to forgive me," Sir Lionel said flatly. "No," Father Brown replied. "I've come to understand you." Sir Lionel laughed weakly. "Understanding is worse." "Sometimes," Father Brown agreed. Sir Lionel stared at the wall. "They needed me, order, direction." "They needed reassurance," Father Brown said. "You gave them commands." Sir Lionel's voice sharpened. "What's the difference?" Father Brown considered. "Reassurance reminds people they are not alone. Commands remind them they are not trusted." Sir Lionel's shoulders sagged. "If I had not acted, chaos would have followed." "Chaos did follow," Father Brown said gently. "It simply wore your face first." Sir Lionel was silent for a long time. "I thought faith was a fire," he said finally. "Something that must be fed." "It is," Father Brown replied, "but not with fear." Sir Lionel looked up. "Will they remember me as a villain?" Father Brown shook his head. "They will remember you as a warning." Sir Lionel closed his eyes. "That may be worse." "It is more useful," Father Brown said quietly. On his last full day in Emberley, Father Brown accompanied Constable Reed on a final walk through the village. Reed seemed lighter, though no less tired. "I keep thinking," Reed said, "that I should have seen it sooner." "You did see it," Father Brown replied. "You simply did not yet know its shape." Reed smiled faintly. "You priests have a way of saying things that sound comforting without promising comfort." Father Brown chuckled. "It saves us a great deal of disappointment." They stopped near the green, where children were playing again, their laughter cautious but genuine. Reed watched them. "You think the village will recover?" "Yes," Father Brown said, "but it will not be the same village." Reed nodded. "Good." That night, the villagers gathered once more at the chapel ruins, not for a vigil, but for a decision. Rain threatened, clouds hanging low and undecided. Julian stood beside Father Brown. "We've agreed not to rebuild it," Julian said quietly. Father Brown looked at him. "Why?" Julian gestured to the stones. "We don't want another monument to certainty. We want a reminder." "A reminder of what?" Father Brown asked. "That faith," Julian said, "should leave room to breathe." Mrs. Alcott stepped forward. "We'll clear it. Make a garden, somewhere quiet." Father Brown smiled. "Silence," he said, "is much kinder when it is chosen." They stood together for a moment, listening to the wind move through broken stone. The next morning, Father Brown packed his small bag. The baker's wife pressed a loaf into his hands. Julian shook his hand awkwardly. Dr. Everly nodded with professional gratitude. At the station, Father Brown paused before boarding. "Father," Julian said, "will you write to us?" Father Brown smiled. "If you are ever tempted to replace questions with answers." Julian laughed. "That often?" "Constantly," Father Brown replied. The train hissed and began to move. As Emberley slipped from view, Father Brown reflected that fires, once extinguished, leave behind two things: scars and warmth. The scars warn, the warmth sustains. Faith, he thought, should do the same. And somewhere behind him, in a village learning again how to listen, the ashes were at last cooling, not into silence, but into something honest enough to endure. Chapter 7. The train had carried Father Brown far from Emberley, yet the village did not release him at once. It lingered in his thoughts with the persistence of a prayer half-spoken, returning not as images of fire or accusation, but as faces, uncertain, searching, newly awake. He sat opposite a young soldier who pretended to read while glancing repeatedly at the priest's cassock, as though unsure whether it offered comfort or interrogation. Father Brown smiled at him once, kindly. The young man flushed and returned to his book, reassured by the absence of judgment. Father Brown reflected that this too was a kind of ministry. At the next junction, the train slowed unexpectedly. A signal delay, the conductor explained apologetically. Father Brown stepped onto the platform to stretch his legs. It was a small station, little more than a name and a bench, set between fields already surrendering to autumn. A woman sat alone there, dressed plainly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she looked up, Father Brown recognized her at once. "Mrs. Alcott," he said gently. She startled, then stood quickly. "Father Brown, I didn't expect—" "Nor did I," he replied. "But journeys are fond of intersections." She hesitated. "I'm going to see my sister. I thought I should leave for a while." "Leaving," Father Brown said, "is sometimes the first honest act." She studied him. "Do you think God is angry with us?" Father Brown considered. "No, I think he is patient." She nodded, as though this answer had been waiting for her. "I was afraid silence meant abandonment." "Silence," Father Brown said softly, "often means trust." The whistle sounded. Mrs. Alcott took his hand briefly, then boarded her carriage. Father Brown returned to his seat, feeling that something small but necessary had been set in order. Back in Emberley, the village was learning how to live without a centerpiece. The chapel garden had begun to take shape, not yet green, but intentional. Stones were cleared, soil turned. Children were discouraged from playing there at first, then encouraged, then allowed without instruction. The place resisted becoming sacred again, and in that resistance found peace. Julian Mercer visited often, sometimes alone, sometimes with others. He brought books, left them behind, rearranged benches that no one had yet agreed were necessary. One afternoon he was joined by Constable Reed, now in plain clothes. "They've offered me a transfer," Reed said, watching a robin hop across the dark soil. Julian raised an eyebrow. "Will you take it?" Reed shrugged. "Maybe. I used to think leaving meant failure. Now I'm not so sure." Julian nodded. "Staying can be just as frightening." Reed smiled faintly. "Father Brown said something like that, didn't he?" "He said many things," Julian replied, "most of them quietly." Sir Lionel Barrington's trial did not draw the crowds many expected. The language of miracles had lost its appetite. When the verdict was delivered, guilty of coercion, of indirect manslaughter, of manipulation, the words landed with less force than silence. Sir Lionel listened without protest. In his cell that evening, he requested pen and paper. He wrote no defense, no apology, no confession. Instead, he wrote a letter to Julian Mercer. "I believed belief was a thing to be shaped. I was wrong. I mistook obedience for devotion and fear for reverence. I do not ask forgiveness. I ask only that you remember how easily certainty becomes cruelty." Julian read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a book of essays he had once loved. He did not know yet what he would do with it, only that he would not burn it. Father Brown arrived at his own parish 2 days later. Life resumed its familiar shape. Confessions, tea, the gentle absurdities of parish councils. Yet Emberley followed him into these small rooms, whispering reminders. During a homily the following Sunday, Father Brown departed unexpectedly from his prepared notes. "There is a temptation," he said, looking out at the congregation, "to believe that faith must shout to be heard, but truth, like conscience, does not raise its voice. It waits." A man in the second pew frowned thoughtfully. A woman near the back smiled. Father Brown concluded simply, "If your faith requires someone else's silence, it is not faith, it is fear." No one applauded. He was grateful. Weeks passed. In Emberley, the garden grew. Herbs were planted instead of flowers. Things useful, modest, quietly persistent. Mrs. Hodge tended them with surprising devotion. Children learned which leaves were safe to touch. The place became neither church nor memorial, but something in between. Julian received a letter from Father Brown. "You will be tempted in time to explain what happened. Resist the urge to tidy it. Let it remain human." Julian smiled as he folded the page. On an overcast afternoon, Dr. Everly found himself standing alone at the edge of the garden, hat in hand. He had come to check on a patient nearby, but found his steps slowing as he passed. He thought of Father Hume, not as a martyr, not as a fool, but as a man whose fear had been dressed in holiness and led astray. The thought no longer burned, it settled. Everly whispered, "I forgive you," though he was no longer certain to whom he spoke. The wind moved gently through the young plants. Somewhere, a bell rang, not from a tower, but from a bicycle passing on the road beyond. That night, Father Brown sat at his desk, writing. He wrote not of Emberley, not of fire, not of Sir Lionel. He wrote of silence, of how silence can be a weapon when imposed and a refuge when chosen. Of how the soul, like a room locked from the inside, can be protected or imprisoned, depending on who holds the key. He paused, pen hovering, then added one final line. Faith survives not because it conquers doubt, but because it outlives it. He set the pen down, satisfied. Some months later, a traveller passing through Emberley would have noticed little remarkable. A quiet village, a modest garden where a chapel once stood, people less eager to explain themselves. Yet, if one listened closely, one might hear something else beneath the ordinary sounds of life. Not certainty, not fear, but a careful attentiveness like breath taken before speech. The fire had passed, judgment had been spoken, and what remained was not silence, but the freedom to choose it. Chapter 8. The first winter, frost came quietly to Emberley, silvering the hedgerows and stiffening the earth around the garden where St. Cuthbert's chapel had once stood. No marker announced the place, no plaque explained it. Only a low stone border remained, softened now by moss and the careful growth of thyme and rosemary. On the morning the frost appeared, Julian Mercer stood there alone. He had brought no book this time. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, breathing slowly, watching his breath appear and vanish. It struck him that this, more than fire or flame, was what he remembered most from the past months, the way things appeared, then disappeared, leaving something altered but intact. He knelt and brushed frost from one of the stones. "I think you'd like this," he said aloud, uncertain whom he addressed. "No one tells it what it has to mean." The village bell rang the hour from a different church down the valley, its sound distant and uninsistent. Julian listened until it faded. Then he rose and went back to living. Far away, Father Brown sat in the small garden behind his parish house, wrapped in a thick coat, his breath curling in the cold air. He was pruning a rose bush with deliberate care, snipping away dead wood without apology or sentiment. The parish cat watched him with suspicion. "You cannot grow by clinging to what no longer lives," Father Brown said, not for the first time, and the cat flicked its tail, unconvinced. A letter lay folded on the bench beside him, recently arrived. It was from Julian. "We have finished the garden, not finished as in complete, only finished as in begun. People come and go without asking permission. Sometimes they speak, sometimes they don't. I think that is enough." Father Brown smiled. He folded the letter and placed it in his pocket, then returned to the rosebush, working slowly, thoughtfully, as though each cut were a small act of faith. In Emberley, life did not return to what it had been. It moved forward instead. Mrs. Alcott began teaching the village children to read, not scripture alone, but stories, histories, poems that contradicted one another cheerfully. She discovered that she enjoyed questions more than answers, and that uncertainty, once feared, had become oddly companionable. Constable Reed took his transfer after all, leaving behind a village that no longer needed him to enforce meaning. On his last walk through the green, he paused by the garden and tipped his hat, not to the past, but to what had grown out of it. Dr. Everley continued his rounds with the same quiet diligence, though he found himself lingering longer with patients who spoke of fear. He no longer hurried them past it. Fear, he had learned, did not always need curing. Sometimes it needed listening. Sir Lionel Barrington lived out his sentence in a place stripped of influence. He was no longer feared, no longer followed. In the absence of an audience, his thoughts lost their edge. On a grey afternoon, he sat alone in the prison yard, watching a sparrow hop along the stones. He wondered, not for the first time, what might have happened if he had listened to Father Hume, to Father Brown, even to his own doubt. The thought did not absolve him, but it softened something. One Sunday, months later, Father Brown found himself invited unexpectedly to speak at a small conference of clergy and teachers. The topic was faith in an age of uncertainty. He listened patiently as others spoke of doctrine, of decline, of strategies to restore conviction. When his turn came, he rose slowly. "I once knew a village," he said, "that mistook certainty for holiness. They believed doubt was disobedience and silence was submission. They learned painfully that faith used as a weapon wounds first the one who wields it." The room was very still. "Faith," Father Brown continued, "is not strengthened by fire. It is strengthened by mercy. It grows not where fear is enforced, but where conscience is allowed to breathe." A man near the front asked, "Then what should faith do?" Father Brown smiled gently. "It should help us tell the truth about ourselves, without requiring someone else to burn for it." He sat down. No one spoke for several seconds. That winter, snow fell thickly on Emberley. Children played in the garden, their laughter rising into the cold air. Footprints crossed and recrossed the space where the chapel had stood, erasing one another without consequence. A bench had been added, unremarkable, already weathered by use. On Christmas Eve, a few villagers gathered there, not for ceremony, but for warmth. Someone brought a lantern, someone else brought bread. They spoke of small things. No one preached, no one explained. And for the first time in many years, belief did not ask to be proven. Late that night, Father Brown walked alone through his own parish, the snow crunching softly beneath his boots. Lights glowed in windows. Somewhere, a piano played imperfectly. He paused beneath a bare tree, looking up at the dark sky. Faith, he reflected, was like breath. You could not see it, could not hold it, could not force it into shape. Yet without it, nothing lived. He thought of Father Hume, fearful, sincere, tragically obedient. He thought of Sir Lionel, certain, commanding, hollowed by his own need to control. He thought of Emberley, learning slowly how not to replace one tyranny with another. And he thought, not for the first time, that the greatest danger to faith was not doubt, but the refusal to allow it. The following spring, the garden bloomed, not magnificently, not miraculously, simply persistently. Visitors passed through and sometimes asked what had been there before. The villagers answered differently, each in their own way. Some spoke of fire, some of silence, some shrugged and spoke of herbs. All answers were allowed, and that perhaps was the truest restoration of all. For the death that would not burn had finally cooled, Not into legend, not into doctrine, but into wisdom, hard won and quietly kept. The ashes had not been erased, they had become soil. And from that soil, something gentler and far more enduring had learned how to grow